And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce my good friend, my rabbi, Mark Cohn.
Good afternoon. I never could have imagined, although before going to rabbinical school, I have a degree, my undergraduate and master's in American history, but that I should wind up working for a synagogue in a town whose town hall is on the home site of the one man who signed all four of America's foundational documents. The Articles of Association in 1774, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Articles of Confederation in 1781, and the Constitution in 1787. I personally move that we change the expression of put your John Hancock on the dotted line to put your Roger Sherman on the dotted line. All in favor? Okay, well, we've gotten that bit of business done. Not only is our synagogue in that town, but there's a church on the town green that was our home for our first 11 years. The first congregational church was Temple Shalom's home from 1959 until the completion of our home on Route 7 in 1971. It was that church where the church had a pastor who was Reverend Stanley Griswold, who in 1801 wrote a remarkable sermon titled, "Truth Its Own Test, and God Its Only Judge," or an inquiry how far men may claim authority over each other's religious opinions, which was then passed along to President Jefferson by State Senator Elijah Boardman of New Milford. Boardman was the grandson, by the way, through his father, of the church's first pastor. It was that sermon and that correspondence between President Jefferson and Senator Boardman about Griswold's sermon that led to this event today, a mere 225 years later. And the topic is near and dear to our Jewish community as we consider the stretches and significance of free speech in an era when Israel and the Jewish people, as ever, are accused, maligned, and mistreated. Some may say demonized, delegitimized, and held to double standards for the very truths upon which our safety depends. How I wish we could have here the Reverend Griswold and President Jefferson on our stage, along with this esteemed panel. So I want to thank today our hosts, the JCC and Sherman and Henry Cooperman, for arranging and partnering with Temple Shalom, and of course our moderators, Ellie Noam and Nadine Strossen, who has coordinated the entire event, and most notably, our guest speaker, Alan Dershowitz, whom I have read and watched and followed, as I know this room has over your many years of public life, of teaching, of advocacy, and of speaking. I'm grateful that the town of New Milford, and more broadly Litchfield County, has been a home for Jewish families and individuals no less than roughly 100 to 150 years, and that we can work together to create a meaningful and proud corner of America.
All right, let me, I'd like to thank JCC and Temple Shalom and the many people who make this happen here. Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you very much, Mark. We had also hoped to get, because of the New Milford historical connection, we had hoped to get the New Milford Historical Society also as a co-sponsor. I have known Ellen Dershowitz longer than I know my wife. When I was a student at Harvard College, maybe it was in graduate school, I don't remember, I taught his kids Hebrew. We became good friends. He had me over for, when I was a student, for group dinners he had for students and faculty and interesting people, and it became a model for Nadine and me later to do this also ourselves because it was such a memorable experience. We also had in my dormitory a very nice indoor swimming pool, and we had group swims there. The dorm was all male until it became co-ed, but the pool remained bathing suit optional. And I can confirm that Alan is indeed Jewish. So at that point, he was mostly a professor of law at Harvard, the youngest tenured professor in law school in Harvard history. And he got there by way of becoming a lawyer, which he describes as his mother saying, you have a big mouth but no brains, so he became a lawyer, right? But he confounded his mother by becoming first in his class at Yale Law School. He clerked for the noted famous judges Bazelon and then Supreme Court Arthur Goldberg. And then he became actually a practicing type lawyer, an appellate lawyer. Appellate lawyers are the ones who fix what the trial lawyers screw up, right? He has become possibly the best known lawyer in America, but possibly also the most disliked lawyer in America, and that is because of his clients. And he is equal opportunity. He has an equal opportunity list of people don't like. From the right, he is disliked because of his clients O.J. Simpson, Julian Assange, and Patty Hearst. From the right, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, and everyone disliked Klaus von Bülow and Leona Helmsley and Mike Tyson. But the crown was really Donald Trump. And despite Ellen's strong support of Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and Obama and others before, the mere temerity in defending the Constitution and the role of the president in a case where people's minds were clearly already made up long before, kind of made him a persona non grata for some people, unfortunately. But not to us here at this community. So thank you very much, Ellen, for coming and being here. And we will divide up. There are two books that Ellen is discussing here, and we divide this up. Nadine will start and also say a few words, and then kind of have some questions and possibly responses to the answers.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead, Nadine.
Thank you, Ellie. Very few words because we want to get to the main event here. But on Sherman, thanks, Mark, for going into the history. I'll just add one fact about Roger Sherman. He actually lived in New Milford, so we can count him as one of four major characters that we're going to talk about from New Milford. And he was on the committee of 5 that drafted and perfected the Declaration of Independence, along with Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson said the following about Roger Sherman, which I think shows that he should indeed be cited instead of John Hancock. Thomas Jefferson says about Roger Sherman, a man who never said a foolish thing in his life. So, Alan, you know, these major characters from New Milford, we've heard something about them from Mark. Elijah Boardman, the Reverend Stanley Griswold, who was really a very interesting kind of iconoclastic guy. And then Charles Beard, the famous history professor, taught at Columbia, actually lived in New Milford and played a role in this.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this beautiful town and this great JCC. Nothing gives a professor more pleasure than working with 2 former students who have contributed so much to the world today. And both of you, I'm so proud of knowing you and having taught you. I have Tony Fletcher sitting here today as my former student. I was hoping for a minion of former students, but I'll settle for 3. If there's any more, please raise your hand. 4? Ah, okay. We're up to half a million. Okay.
Does it have to be a woman?
No, not for my minion. No, my minion, women. A couple of comments just generally about what has been said before. I'm happy to change the John Hancock reference to Roger Sherman, except that I have a collection of framers and founders of America, and I have John Hancock's John Hancock, but I do not have Roger Sherman. So the deal is, let's change it, but you got to get me an autograph so I can include that in my collection. I am so pleased that Ellie confirmed my Jewishness. He didn't have to, because I graduated from City College of New York CCNY, College for Circumcised New Yorkers. It was very well known, so I already had my yichus from that. And I always love to speak in the presence of my magnificent and fantastic wife, Carolyn, who's sitting in the front row, and who is the key to any successes I've ever had as a teacher, a parent, and everything else. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carolyn. This is such a beautiful place. I mean, just having gone for a brief lunch at Ellie and Nadine's house, I can't imagine why anybody would ever leave here. This is paradise on the Housatonic River.
We also introduced Alan to the elephant trunk. Now, for
I bought a poster. I didn't even bargain. I saw the poster and I said, "That's worth around $100. I'll pay $100." I said, "How much is it?" He said, $45. So I didn't even bargain. I just bought the poster. It's in the back of the car, and I'm looking forward to hanging it. So, a little bit about this city. It's just unbelievable how much history is here. I didn't know who I didn't know Boardman, Griswold. I didn't know any of those folks until I came across this letter, and then I did all my research and found out the close connection. Oh, by the way, you mentioned all my notorious clients. You left out the one who lives here. I represented Mia Farrow in her lawsuit against Woody Allen. And my wife and I drove up here to visit her the day the alleged incident occurred that became the headline story. So my wife and my wife, who's a PhD psychologist, was there virtually and is almost an eyewitness to what didn't happen. And so the connections that I have to this town, both through our friends here, are great. And you mentioned the framers of our Constitution. Among the framers of our Constitution, our way of life, the Federalist Papers, the Bill of Rights, were both Madison and Hamilton, both of whom spoke Hebrew. Madison spoke Hebrew quite well, having studied it at Princeton. Hamilton, because he was born an illegitimate child, could not get into the Christian school in the Caribbean island, so he actually went to a Jewish school for 2 years in which he learned the prayers and would occasionally recite them to friends in New York. And Hamilton, people don't realize this, was the lawyer for the Jewish community of New York. What does that mean? New York, unlike Virginia and Massachusetts, New York was the industrial center and trade. And the trade was conducted largely between New Yorkers and people who came from the old country, particularly Amsterdam and Rotterdam and places like that. And many of them were Jews. And Hamilton was the lawyer for the industrialists. And so he had a lot of Jewish clients and was very friendly with the Jewish community and always regaled them with his few words of Hebrew that he knew from his second, third, or fourth grade, whenever it was. So the connections between this book, the Jefferson book, and this town is one that I have long wanted to exploit, and here I am. I can actually be here, sit in the place where a lot of these events occurred. And of course, the letter was written on Erev July 4th. It was written July 3rd at night in what would then become the Oval Office. Jefferson lived in the White House, and he wrote this letter on the eve of the 25th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And it's, for that reason and other reasons, quite a significant letter. But thank you for inviting me to the place where it all happened, the room where it happened. Here it is.
And Jefferson died exactly 25 years later. He died exactly 25 years later.
Along with John Adams, who represented even worse people than I represented. He represented the people who were accused of the Boston Massacre, and boy, did he get hell from his cousin, Sam Adams, for representing these bad guys. But he stood up to it, and I've tried my best to not only follow in his footsteps, but more importantly, to follow in the footsteps of Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham, who represented the sinners of Saddam, and who shook his finger at God when God said he was going to kill all the people of Saddam. And Abraham, the world's first lawyer, shook his finger at God and said, Chalila lacha, hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. How dare you, God? It would be profane of you. The Lord of all the universe will not himself do justice? Chalila lacha. If I ever said Chalila to my grandmother, she'd smack me in the face. But Abraham had the guts to stand up to God and argue with him. And he won a Pyrrhic victory. He said, what if there are 10 innocent people? God said, if there are 10, I'll spare them. Unfortunately, there weren't 10, so he didn't spare them. But he won the Pyrrhic victory. So we stand in the footsteps of a great many great lawyers.
Wonderful. Well, Alan, you said, I'm going to the exact quote here, thanks to Mark, that you said that you're a fabulous collector. Ellie and I have been privileged to visit a couple of your homes, and every single square inch is just plastered with the most amazing memorabilia and historic documents. It's almost impossible to leave the bathroom. There's so much to read. But so of this, and we've been the beneficiary of your collecting. A few years ago, you gave us this, knowing about our love for Connecticut Tercentenary, 1635 to 1935. But you said in this book that this particular letter is the greatest acquisition of my career as a collector. Is that still true?
Absolutely, without any doubt, and it happened completely by accident. I was having lunch with my son, Midtown, New York, and we were supposed to go somewhere, and it got canceled, and I said, Elon, do you mind if just pass by the Argosy bookstore? I love to go there. I know the woman, Mrs. Cohn, who owns it, and I always ask her, do you have any Brooklyn Dodger memorabilia or anything? And she said, yeah, I have a signed autograph of Carl Furillo. I said, yeah, no, I already have that. Anything else? She said, well, I just got this letter from Jefferson. What? Yeah, I just got a letter from Jefferson. It's never been owned by anybody except the family that received it, the Boardman family, and it came in the original envelope, and it was unbelievable. And she asked me for a price, and I always bargain. I didn't in this recent flea market, but I always do, and I try to bargain her. But she saw I would pay anything for this, and so she didn't budge one bit. And I bought it on a Friday, and by Monday I had written 10,000 words of this book. It combined all of my passions: collecting, Jefferson, freedom of speech, history. It was as if, Hashem came down and wanted to present me with a gift, and this was the gift. And so I have the letter hanging in my house. In fact, the name of the book is Finding Jefferson, but when we decided to put it out in paperback, we decided to give it a slightly sexier title, so we call it Finding, Framing, and Hanging Jefferson. And so we framed him, and we now hang him. And so it is the great, and let me tell you, I've had acquisitions. I have original copies of the Bill of Rights with the first 12 amendments instead of 10 amendments. I have an original copy of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. I have letters from Jabotinsky, from Begin, from Ben-Gurion. In fact, I'm working on my retirement book. It's called Founding Fathers and One Jewish Mother. And the one Jewish mother is Golda Meir, and it's a comparison between the founders of America, Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, and the founders of Israel, Weizmann, Ben-Gurion, Begin, etc. And so I collect a lot of Zionist memorabilia and a lot of American early independence memorabilia. But this one is number one.
Wow. And let me hone in now on what is so extraordinary about the letter and really meaningful to me. I've been privileged to speak here several times about my passion for freedom of speech. And the letter, first of all, I was surprised. Jefferson never wrote any books. He communicated a lot, but it was through letters. And this is the only written discussion he has really of liberty in general, you make the point, Alan, but in particular of freedom of speech. And what he says in the letter is inconsistent with what many respected historians, including Leonard Levy, had believed about Jefferson's views. So why don't you tell us about that, Alan?
Well, it's so interesting. A lot of people think Jefferson's views on freedom of speech grow out of his views on federalism and his disdain for particularly federal judges, and some of it did. He didn't think that the federal government should have the power to regulate speech or religion, but he did think at some point in his life perhaps the state should. I came across an early copy of Madison's draft of the the Bill of Rights, and in it his First Amendment, which was the Third Amendment, applies to the states as well, but then he changed that view. There was a big debate going on at the time of this letter as to whether freedom of speech was really freedom of conscience and freedom of opinion, or whether it also applied to advocacy. And what Griswold had said in the sermon is, no, it doesn't apply to advocacy. If you advocate things that are immoral, then that could be prohibited by law, and Jefferson wrote and said no. And he wrote in a way that resonates. I mean, we think of the marketplace of ideas, and the marketplace of ideas is central to this letter, and the idea that people will judge things based on more speech rather than less speech. And the key part of the letter says, the conscience of the judge would then become the standard of morality, which he didn't want. And if the law is to punish what not squares with that standard, the line is to be drawn by that. It will vary with the varying consciences of the same with different judges, and will totally prostrate the rights of conscience in others. That I agree with. But now here's a sentence that is very controversial and a key to Jefferson's point, and something that I disagree with. And I'd really like to hear what Nadine has to say about that as well. Here's the sentence. The key sentence is, but we have nothing to fear from the demoralizing reasoning of some if others are left free to demonstrate their errors, and especially when the law stands ready to punish the first criminal act produced by the false reasoning. We have nothing to fear. And my view is we have a lot to fear. That free speech is extraordinarily dangerous. And that to undervalue what damage and danger free speech can do is not to fully appreciate and understand the amazing experiment that our First Amendment is. We are still the only country in the world today, the only country that has full and complete and total recognition of free speech. Even Canada, all kinds of exceptions. Great Britain, all kinds of exceptions. Israel, all kinds of exceptions. But the United States, Congress shall make no law, no law, no law. It's interesting. Felix Frankfurter, whose professorship I sat on for years, and Hugo Black used to have this enormous fight about what the First Amendment meant. And I remember hearing one day that Felix Frankfurter was arguing that the states the states perhaps could limit free speech, and Black was saying no, nothing at all. And so Black was a little tiny, both between the two of them, Frankfurter and Black, between the two of them, they were 10 feet tall. One was like 4'9", and the other was like 4'11". They were tiny little guys. When you saw them arguing in the Supreme Court, you'd see the top of their heads over the bench. And they both were very expressive people. And Black, at one point, said, I want to read to you the First Amendment. And everybody was quiet. And he said, Congress shall make no law, no law, no law. And Felix Frankfurter said, no, you're misreading it. It says, Congress shall make no law. So it, all depended on how you read it and which word you wanted to emphasize. But Jefferson comes down very, very strongly on behalf of there being nothing to worry about. Well, there's plenty to worry about, but it's worth the worry.
Yeah.
And what's worse than worrying about what free speech can do is worrying about what the absence of free speech can do. So it requires a kind of nuanced approach to the problem, not just an absolutist approach.
And I very much agree with your position, Alan, that harmful and dangerous as free speech can be, it is less harmful and dangerous than empowering the government, more than it is already reasonably empowered if you can show the kind of direct connection to imminent harm from particular speech uttered in context.
Okay, so I'm going to throw a question at you, since I'm your old professor. What if you're wrong about that? What if it turns out that free speech is actually empirically more dangerous than censorship? What if it turns out that historically, giving the government the power to constrain free speech will cause less harm? Would you change your mind?
I don't think I would, because
Okay,
I would be
that's the
looking.
key.
I would be looking to the future, and my hope for improving society in every way, including countering terrorism, countering anti-Semitism, I think absolutely depends on the most robust free speech.
You should have been the professor and me the student, because I completely agree with exactly. I mean, it's amazing how, we're so different in so many ways. Our age is different, our backgrounds are different, our history is different, and yet we share such a common perspective on free speech.
And we didn't talk about this in advance, and we have debated each other. We've debated each other on the Today Show, remember, a couple of times. But Alan, we have very little time before we segue to the other important theme and book here, and I want to contrast the American approach, which you and I have endorsed, but even more importantly, the U.S. Supreme Court has endorsed, with the Israeli approach. I was so struck when I reread the book last night about this very poignant, tragic episode in which you were scheduled to meet with Yitzhak Rabin, ended up 10 days after he had been assassinated, specifically because he wanted to pick your brain about the connection between the rabid rhetoric that was being spewed against him that may ultimately have contributed to his assassination.
Yeah, it was a Friday, and I got a call from the Israeli Consul General in Boston saying the Israeli ambassador to the United States, who is a professor of constitutional law, in fact, at Tel Aviv University, would like to come to see you, and sure, of course, comes to see me on Friday, and he says on Tuesday, Prime Minister Rabin is coming to Boston to speak at the General Assembly, which is the organization of Jewish groups around the country, and he's asked to have lunch with you. And he wants to discuss a particular subject with you. He would respect your views on this. He thinks that the conversations in Israel are becoming so overheated and so overwrought, and people are accusing each other of disloyalty and treason and etc., that he's very worried that violence could ensue. And he wants to know your view on where the appropriate line should be in the absence of a written constitution. Remember, there's no First Amendment in Israel. The absence of a written constitution, he wants to know what's the right approach so he could advocate it for when speech may go too far toward incitement. And of course, I have my little notebook, and I wrote down Tuesday lunch, and of course, that Saturday night he was murdered. And we never had the lunch. I could never take it out of my notebook. And it was one of the saddest days in my life because I loved Yitzhak Rabin. He represented everything I stood for in Israel and was a real peacemaker. And I think, we often hear about how assassinations are terrible, but they work. They work. This assassination worked. This assassination set back the cause of peace for many, many years, and in fact, diminished it maybe forever. The assassination of Lincoln worked. It caused the elevation of Johnson, who was a terrible president, the end of, obviously, Reconstruction. So assassinations, tragically, can sometimes work. And this one did, unfortunately. But, you know, it was such a poignant moment for me to be able to give advice, to want to give advice to the Prime Minister of Israel. I've had the honor of giving advice to prime ministers and presidents, but this perhaps would have been the most important bit of advice that I could have given. I never got to give it.
And your book describes how at least one rabbi who, according to the book, placed a curse on Rabin was actually convicted, but you said that was not quite accurate.
No,
and was reversed.
What was accurate, it just changed. What happened was this. There was this Sephardic rabbi, whose name I can't remember now, who issued a particular curse. It's a particular curse that comes from the Kabbalah, I think. And it calls on the angels of God to kill this rodef. The Hebrew word rodef means somebody who's about to rise up and kill you, you can kill him first. And so he was indicted for inciting violence by, in his rabbinical and pastoral role, calling for the killing of the prime minister, which then happened. But Israel, the Supreme Court of Israel, in those days at least, under Aaron Barak, was so deeply committed to free speech that they reversed the conviction on the ground that he didn't call explicitly for human beings to kill Rabin. He called for the angels of God to kill Rabin. I'm not sure that was the right decision. I'm not sure. It's a close case because when a rabbi calls on the angels of God to kill, certainly it would be very easy for individuals to misinterpret that as a call for individuals to help kill. We know the biblical stories of God inspiring the killing of Pinchas killing the Gentiles and things of that kind. So rabbinical voices, you'll understand, can have enormous impact. And I can easily understand also a court applying a double standard and saying if a priest or a rabbi, I mean, we're commemorating the Pope's death now, and just think about how significant it was that this Pope's predecessor, Pius XII, refused to condemn Hitler, refused to condemn genocide, and his excuse, unbelievably, Pope Pius XII, was, I did not want to create a crisis of conscience among German soldiers who would have to choose between obeying the German command and obeying the rules of the Vatican Church. If the Church doesn't create a conflict of conscience over genocide, what good is the Church? And so I am not a fan of Pope Pius the 12th, and I have mixed feelings about the current Pope and his views toward Israel. You may understand that Israel did not send a delegation to the Pope's funeral because of things that this Pope has said about Israel. They sent the Vatican ambassador to pay his respects and do all the right things minimally, but did not go out of their way, as Israel did for Pope John Paul XXIII and others who were much more positive toward Jews and toward Israel. The current church is simply part of what we'll talk about, I'm sure, in the next time, but the progressive movement, which today thinks that to be progressive, you have to be super critical of Israel.
Well, for the rest of the fascinating details in this book, you're going to have to read it, because we're now turning to another fascinating book, one of 57 that so far have been generated by this. I guess you don't really have a problem with writer's block, do you, Alan? Ellie.
Well, thank you very much. We strayed already into the Middle East. Now I'll stray a little bit into the Northeast here. Since you mentioned the funeral of the Pope and two American presidents were there, So I have a question for you. Name an American president who sent the American Navy and Marines to fight against Muslim fighters
Thomas Jefferson,
who threatened American shipping, who put high tariff barriers to the import of products from Europe, who worked to buy a distant territory in North America from a European country, who lived in a big mansion in the South, who had inappropriate relations.
I can sing you the answer.
And who lost in a disputed presidential election but won the next one, who, by the way, lost 3 consecutive presidential elections in Connecticut. Only 2. That is true for only 2 states, the other one being Delaware. And who then actively pushed for the criminal prosecution of a political rival.
And who attacked the Supreme Court and said that the president should not have to obey the commands of the Supreme Court.
Well, I'll sing you the answer. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. It was Thomas Jefferson who attacked the Arab marauders who had been taking hostages of American sailors, and who, of course, bought Louisiana, or was it Greenland? I can't remember. I think it was, and without congressional approval. After running, by the way, the difference is he ran on a campaign, Jefferson did, he ran on a campaign of a weak president, that he would not take actions against the views of Congress, that Congress was the action taker, that it makes laws. He hated judicial lawmaking, but he also was against, in theory, presidential lawmaking and was in favor of strong congressional. But, you know, once you become president, things change. And so it's so interesting because Americans, with the exception, of course, we have our rabbi here who's a historian, we have many people in this audience who I'm sure are great knowledgeable of history, but the lack of knowledge among young Americans today about our history and about our traditions is just appalling. And I don't know how to cure that, but it really shows up every day. So,
thank you.
Great question, thanks.
Okay, let me bring it now to more to the shores of Massachusetts. At Harvard, your university, on Saturday, October 7th, 2023,
Yep.
33 student groups signed off on a statement accusing Israel of violence already on that day, and wrote, the massacres in Gaza have already commenced. This was at a time when not a single Israeli soldier had crossed the border, when conversely Hamas fighters were still in southern Israel, when countless Israeli young people and old-timers were lying on the ground dead or wounded. But the Harvard groups already accused Israel of atrocities within hours. Shoot off your mouth first, deny the facts later. So my question to you is, with so many smart people at Harvard, students, faculty, what happened at that university and at other universities for the respect for the scientific method of weighing the facts, for rational analysis, for civil discourse? What went wrong, and how did it go wrong, and what is the way back? But first, before we get to the way back, let's talk about how can you explain the drift of so many of this generation of students to such hatred of the Jewish state?
Well, if you want to identify one word, the word is intersectionality. And that is, for the last 10 or 15 years, this fake academic discipline called intersectionality has become the dominant thought among the progressive left. And intersectionality can be manifested by something that was on CNN on Friday. You had a woman, very strong woman up there, making a speech, and I think it was in front of Harvard, saying we must fight for transgender rights, we must fight for transgender rights, we must make sure that people understand that transgender people are equal in every respect to other people, but you cannot fight for transgender rights unless you are also anti-Israel. You cannot support transgender rights, and we've heard this about gay rights, we've heard it about climate rights, we've heard it about women's rights, we've heard it about every single element of what we would call the liberal, what we have fought for all of our lives. You cannot join any of those groups. Berkeley made it as clear as before October 7th, a year before, 13 constitutional clubs at Berkeley, that is, clubs that are part of the Constitution of Berkeley and are paid for by state funding, 13 groups issued declarations saying no speaker will be allowed to speak to our group unless they certify that they are anti-Zionist. That would include, by the way, the dean of the law school couldn't speak, Erwin Chemerinsky. I couldn't speak. You couldn't speak about abortion or about free speech or about anything else. This was all before October 7th. October 7th was the most visible manifestation of something that's been going on for years and years. I like to place the time, this is very self-serving, but I like to place the time this happened at Harvard on July 1st, 2014. Why? Because that's when I retired from Harvard. And that's when Ruth Weiss retired from Harvard. And when Ruth and I left Harvard, what had been below the surface became to the surface, and not a single Harvard professor would be willing to stand up against it. At the law school, 100 professors, probably half of them are Jewish. Not one single professor, not one, not Noah Feldman, none, are prepared to stand up and stand up for the imperfect state of Israel. We're not talking about Netanyahu, we're not talking about Likud, we're not talking about Smertrich or Ben Gvir. We're talking about the concept of Zionism. And you cannot get a single professor. At the university, I would say, of the 1,000 professors at the university, maybe now there are 5 muted voices that will speak up. Columbia, I was invited to Columbia a few years ago at the law school and asked to speak, and I said, well, what do you need me? No, we can't get a single professor at the law school to speak up for Israel. So this is a deep cultural issue. It involves BDS, it involves DEI, and let's talk about DEI for a second. The bureaucracies that create DEI, look, we're all in favor of diversity, we're all in favor of equity, we're all in favor of inclusion. Those are wonderful concepts, except that DEI doesn't believe in diversity. It believes only in racial diversity. It doesn't believe in any kind of ideological diversity, political diversity, any other kind. Equity, what is equity? It's exactly the opposite of equality. Equality means you judge people by individual meritocratic considerations. You can broaden the concept of what meritocratic means. It doesn't mean grades. It doesn't mean only publications. It can mean, a million things that are based on your ability to perform the task at hand. But it can't be solely race or gender. I mean, you can't give preference, as the Supreme Court said, to the son of a black billionaire hedge fund operator whose mother is a professor at MIT and who has inherited wealth over some kid from Appalachia. There's just nothing right about that. You could say that people of color presumptively have had to resist all kinds of... You take all of that into account in defining meritocracy. But once you come to a definition of what meritocracy is, the Supreme Court has said you have to apply that, whether you're a public or a private university, and certainly if you're a university who's receiving federal funding. So DEI has become bureaucratized at Harvard. It's deeply embedded. The reason that President Gay of Harvard was not because of what she said. When she was asked by Stefanik, does Harvard prohibit calling for genocide? That wasn't why she was fired. It's what she hadn't said when it came to other groups. She was applying a double standard. She was saying you can say about Jews what you cannot say about gays and about women and about blacks. And so she was not applying the single standard. And that's because of DEI. DEI says you don't apply a single standard. Equity means that you have to create a broad culture of making reparations. And this is deep. This is very deep in the culture of Harvard and other places. And it will take years to undo. Even if Harvard and the Trump administration make a deal, which I think they will, by the way. I think they'll make a deal because Harvard hired 2 lawyers after flexing its muscles and saying we will never compromise. They hired 2 lawyers who are very close to the Trump administration to negotiate a deal. So they'll negotiate a deal. But the deal won't get to this cultural issue.
Ellie,
and it's very deep.
Ellie asked Alan what we can do moving forward, and I want to put a plug in for your book that we're talking about now, the 10 Big Anti-Israel Lies.
Which, by the way, you can all get a copy free
yes,
as we leave here.
You know, I gave a copy of it to a Yale student who has befriended me about some of these issues. I've never met him in person. He can't be here today, but he said, I read Alan Dershowitz, the 10 Big Anti-Israel Lies recently, found it to be an incredible read. I started giving out copies to friends, both Jewish and non-Jewish. It completely changed how some of them think and speak about Israel. One friend who had never really known what Zionism meant now proudly calls himself a Zionist because of the book. It really does sharpen minds. So I hope all of you will disseminate it widely to stimulate discussion and critical thinking, which is what Ellie asked about.
What I worry about, and this goes to Ellie's question too, today at Harvard you could not have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Half the school would say we don't want to hear Lincoln, half the school would say we don't want to hear Douglas. We've made up our mind. There is no debate. There is no discussion. What we have are just bump a sticker, yelling at each other, and these encampments and protests. We're all in favor of protests in the right setting, in the right time, but not as a substitute for thinking or as a substitute for dialogue and debate. I offered to come to Harvard and debate Professor Crispo at the law school, who's very anti-Israel. He declined. He won't debate me. I have offered to debate anybody at Harvard, at Columbia, anywhere. And, you know, I'm not necessarily at the top of my game, 86 years old, but I'll take on anyone just to have a debate to get this thing going. You cannot have a debate today about these issues.
Let me, Ellen, what you're describing is some form of a conformity in almost kind of like a established type religion almost. John McWhorter, a colleague of mine at Columbia, described, in fact, wokeness as a religion. But
I would describe it as a cult.
But even worse, it's kind of become the established religion. And here, let me make a connection to the Jefferson era again, which is at that time. Connecticut had an established church. Sure. Most people don't know that although Connecticut calls itself the Constitution state, it actually, at the time of Jefferson, was the only state that had no constitution.
No established religion.
No. Oh. It had no constitution, and it had an established religion. The established religion was Congregationalism.
Oh, yeah.
Puritan.
Yeah.
And the Reverend Griswold was the minister of that religious church. Established religion meant that the church could tax everybody, not just its members, that its minister was a public official.
Right.
There were other religions that had come up, the Episcopalians and Baptists and Methodists and Quakers, but they had no equal status at all. It was not until that system was supported by the Federalist Party, which was not the Jefferson Party; it was the Adams Party that had lost the election. It was supported by the established families. Griswold was family, the Boardman family. These were established families that supported the Federalist Party, which supported the establishment situation of the Congregational Church. In 1818, finally, there was the election swung to something called the something tolerant party, which was basically the Jeffersonians plus several of these other churches.
It's interesting. Yeah.
And they changed the Constitution in 1818. That was the Constitution that stayed till 1965. Mm-hmm. That Constitution had a clause for the first time of religious freedom, and all religions should be the same, except no, because when it was the draft was all religions have no religion shall be given to any religious sect or mode of worship. There was amended after long discussion to any Christian sect or mode of worship. And furthermore, there were some other qualifications in another clause of the Constitution. So this was a disestablishment of the Congregational Church, but it was not a kind of putting Jews or Muslims or Buddhists or whatever on the same status that took I think till 1870, based on the federal Constitution, that was changed.
Well, you know, it's interesting because there's so much historical ambivalence. In 1790, President Washington receives a letter from Rabbi Sextus, S-E-X-I-U-S, Sextius, who was the chief rabbi of the Newport, Rhode Island synagogue. And Rabbi Sextus writes a letter to Washington congratulating him on being elected the first president. And he says in it, of tolerance we should no longer talk, as if one group by its own power tolerates the other. Every religion shall sit under its own fig tree, and we'll ask of them only that they be patriotic and loyal to the United States. Without being charged with plagiarism, George Washington then writes back in his own words, adopting all of those words from Rabbi Sextus, saying, of tolerance we will no longer speak. That letter is the first document in world history, to create, at least in theory, equality, full equality for Jews. It had almost happened 50 years earlier in England. In 1750, the British Parliament passed what was called the Jew Law, which said you did not have to be a Christian in order to get the advantages of the Magna Carta, etc. I have a copy of that law. I own a copy of that actual law. Within 1 year, it was rescinded because the public was outraged that Jews would be getting equality. And so they went back to the established, and of course today in England there is an established church, there's no doubt. The current king, is the first king ever to favor disestablishment, but he's not done it openly. You know, when I was a kid, we were always asked a riddle, what's the longest word in the English language? Anti-disestablishmentarianism. It's actually a very important word, because there were a group of people who wanted to disestablish the Anglican Church, and then there were those who were opposed to it. They didn't want to establish it, but they didn't want to disestablish it. And so they were anti-disestablishmentarianisms, although they were not in favor of establishment. So it's a complicated history, but in 1890, the Federalist Party, which was Washington, it was before parties, but he became the head of the Federalist Party, favored...
Hamilton.
Huh?
Hamilton.
Yeah, no, Hamilton became the first official head, but Washington was his mentor, and Washington favored no tolerance. But then tolerance became the word even later when they said, we will tolerate other religions. And I think, you know, hopefully we live in a time now when it's not toleration, but the history, the relationship between Jews and the government has been a long and complex one and an interesting one, but the United States has been ahead of every other country in the world in its staff. No, we've never had a Jewish president. France has had Jewish prime ministers. Many countries in the world now have had Jewish. Mexico has a Jewish president, but the United States never has. But the situation of equality in the United States today is still probably better for Jews than any time in history.
Let me ask you the last question, because so that we can have audience questions. I should also mention that that Constitution of Connecticut of 1818 gave the right to vote to white male, white. And here too, it in effect abolished the ability to vote for people who had actually African Americans who had been able to vote before 1880.
Right.
And it was until 1870, again, under federal constitution, that people could, like Americans could, citizens of Connecticut could vote. Now, my question to you is, and the last one, the political battles today are highly polarized, but in many ways they were incredibly polarized also at that time.
Sure.
Jefferson, the Federalists versus the they were called Republicans, but they're really Democrats. So in the media were highly polarized, and they were kind of either you were a friend or you were a foe. But then came an era of good feelings, in which people actually kind of where the political disputes were much more muted for quite a while. Things calmed down considerably. Now, do you expect the same now?
No, I don't. First of all, we've always had deep divisions. Thomas Jefferson was very, very close to John Adams' wife. They had a very close friendship until Jefferson pardoned Callender, who had been a newspaper reporter who had attacked Adams viciously. I wouldn't say there was ever a period of goodwill. Jacksonian democracy was the beginning of kind of established official presidential racism against Native Americans. It was a terrible time. The Clay era, the fights were about slavery and extending slavery to the newly established territories. I would say the only time that there's been relatively peaceful and not contentious was probably at a time when Jim Crow was the established approach and anti-women. So, you had all these things were accepted, but they were beneath the surface. I can't think, you're the historian, but I can't think of a period of American history that I'm aware of where there has been a willingness to just discuss issues rationally. Of course, you can say Lincoln, Douglas, they did have those debates. Clay, they did have those debates. Maybe we're in a very bad situation now because, as I say, we can't even have those debates. And here I'm going to say something that's very controversial, I think, and I agree with Ruth Weiss, who had an article in the Wall Street Journal just this past couple of days ago. In almost every instance, not so much in American history, but in world history in the last several hundred years, Jews have been at the center of the hatred and the controversy, one way or another. McCarthyism. My wife and I just saw the play on Broadway yesterday, the Edward R. Murrow play, about how Edward R. Murrow fought against McCarthyism. McCarthyism was anti-Semitism. A very important element of it was blaming the Jews for being communists. I actually got to know Roy Cohn, believe it or not, because he was Klaus von Bülow's daughter's lawyer. And so I got to know him. I hated his guts, but I got to know him. But we had a long dinner one night in which he explained to me why he had become so fervent McCarthyite anti-communist. He said because he grew up at an age when communism was blamed on the Jews, and he wanted to be a visible Jew with the name Cohen who was fighting for American patriotism, for McCarthyism, against communism. He overdid it, and like so many others, even if your heart's in the right place, if you don't believe in due process and you're prepared to do anything. But, the real question is a question that was asked by two rabbis that I know some years ago in a book entitled Why the Jews? Why the Jews? It starts with a joke. It starts with a joke. Hitler is giving a speech at Nuremberg, and he screams out, "Who causes all the problems of the world in Germany today?" And everybody starts yelling, "Who causes all the problems in the whole world today?" And before anybody can answer, one guy screams out, "The bicycle riders." And Hitler turns to him and says, "Why the bicycle riders?" And the man responds and says, "Why the Jews?" And that became the title of the book. And the question is, the Jews have played such an incredibly central role in every aspect, positive and negative. And I think Israel is serving largely today as an excuse for the radicalization and the attempt to really change America and make it much more radical and much more left and much less involved. Obviously, the political situation in America contributes to that as well without getting partisan or political. But you cannot understand what's going on in American universities today if you ignore the Jews. If you imagine that this was about another country, say about Darfur, it wouldn't happen. It's the central role of Jews, and nobody's been able to figure out what the answer to that is, whether it's psychological, whether it's religious. B'kol dor v'dor omdem aleinu l'chalotenu, utzu etzu v'tufa. I mean, v'hishe amda lavotenu. How much of our prayer is based on the fact that we recognize that they have always been coming after us, and we've responded. And we respond in so many different ways. We respond by so many Jews joining them and becoming anti-Zionists, becoming the Peter Beinhardts who are welcomed in places like Temple Emmanuel. I am banned in Temple Emmanuel. I can't speak in Temple Emmanuel. Peter Beinhardt is paid $35,000 to deny Israel's right to exist at Temple Emmanuel. I can't speak at the 92nd Street Y, but the enemies of Israel can speak at the 92nd Street Y. I can't even speak at the Ramah School in Manhattan today because I'm controversial. And I don't want to make this personal, but the idea that a strong Zionist Jew today is regarded as somebody who's beyond the pale of acceptable discourse. A professor at Harvard Law School, Noah Feldman, wrote the cover story for Time magazine about the Jewish problem. And in it, he ended by saying, "Look inward, the problem is with the Jews." And that's just not right. The Jews have become a central focal point of the issue. And I have to admit, I've written a lot and I've thought a lot, and I don't think I'm stupid, but I cannot figure it out. I cannot fully understand why the Jews have played such a central role throughout history. A certain people in the book of Esther, in the book of Shemot, and you go. There's never a time in history when there hasn't been an extraordinary focus on Jews, and there's no way to end that. We are successful despite, maybe because of the anti-Semitism. There's a lot of jealousy. There's a lot of recrimination. And it causes so many problems within the Jewish community of people both overreacting against it, overreacting for it. And we have to figure out a way as a Jewish community of appropriately responding. Look, I have one way of responding. I have just one way. I have just one message. And because I'm not smart enough to figure out the cause. But I am smart enough to figure out what we have to do. And it comes from the Psalms of David. And it's God's admonition to the Jewish people. Hashem oz li'amo yitain, Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. The Psalm of David says, God will give the Jewish people strength. Only then will there be peace. So I am totally and absolutely convinced that whatever the causes are, the only answer is Jewish strength. Jewish strength that's disproportionate to the strength of our enemies. Jewish strength that will be used to protect us. Jewish strength that emphasizes at different times in our history, Im ein ani li mili, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am for myself alone, what am I? We have for so many centuries been at the forefront of helping others, being at the forefront of putting the needs of others even before our own. I started out my career marching in the South on behalf of African Americans. It was one of the proudest times of my life. But I want a little reciprocity. I want to see African Americans march with us, and we're not seeing it. I want to see gay Americans march with us, and we're not seeing it. So the one thing we cannot do is compromise our strength. We must remain stronger than all of our enemies combined, militarily, psychologically, politically, economically, and in every other way. It's the only sure protection in a world that is so confused about Jews that we can't count on their goodwill to protect us. We have to count on our strength and putting our strength first. So I hate to end on a negative note like that, but I think it's a very important one.
No, this is not the end. It's just the beginning of the question and answer period.
Ladies and gentlemen, before you ask your questions, I'm going to ask that you wait for the microphone, please, so that everybody can hear your question. Thank you very much.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Dershowitz. Earlier this week in the Times of Israel, Mike Huckabee, the new U.S. ambassador in Jerusalem, was asked, do you still support the annexation of the West Bank? And Mike Huckabee, according to the Times of Israel, answered, there's a difference between stealing land and purchasing land. Do you agree?
Well, remember, Israel was established by purchasing land from distant Syrian mostly, but Arab landowners. There never was a country called Palestine. There was a British mandate in which there were many Jewish residents and many Arab Muslim residents. In Jerusalem in 1832, they took the first census involving religion, found out the overwhelming plurality of the residents of Jerusalem were Jewish. Second were Christians. Third were Muslims. And so buying land has been a legitimate way of establishing geographical solidarity. I myself am in favor of a two-state solution if it's possible. If you can get a two-state solution with peace. Today, Abbas appointed his successor, and his successor is somebody who has better relations with Israel than others who might have been his successor. So, you know, in Israel they say a pessimist is someone who says, oy vey, things are so bad they can't get worse. An optimist says, yes, they can. I'm both a pessimist and an optimist. Things could get worse, but they can get better. I'm not giving up on the possibility of a Palestinian state living in peace. I'm willing to accept any reasonable way of achieving that goal. I wouldn't exclude anything. Mike Huckabee is a friend of ours. My wife and I are very close to Mike and his wife. They're wonderful people, but he sees Israel through the eyes of Christianity. And for him, the West Bank is not the West Bank, it is Yehuda and Shomron. And he strongly believes that God gave what is called the West Bank to the Jewish people. But as he's also said, and I believe this, I know it's true, he said, I am not the President of the United States. I don't make policy. I am the ambassador, and I implement the policy of the President of the United States. So although we know what his personal views are, and they're very strong. By the way, David Friedman's personal views were exactly the same. He wrote a book on that, One State, just recently. And David is another good friend of ours. And but the policy of the United States is still in favor of some negotiated resolution, and my hope is that that remains possible. October 7th made it much more difficult. Much more difficult. Remember, why did the peace movement get weakened in Israel? It got weakened because after Clinton offered with Ehud Barak, the Palestinians 96% of the West Bank, 96%, plus 4.5% of Israel for 100.5%, including the entire Gaza Strip. The response was not no. The response was blowing up buses with children on it. That was the response, and that's what destroyed the peace camp. And that's what brought the current government to power. It was the Palestinian rejection, as Clinton has said most recently. When you walk away from a peace offer like that, don't expect it to get renewed. You're never going to get that good a peace offer. And so I do think that the responsibility for the current situation lies squarely with Arafat and with Palestinian leadership. To show you my commitment to the First Amendment. So this is about 5 years before, Arafat dies. Okay, Arafat dies. Students for Justice in Palestine come to me. They weren't called that then, but they were the predecessor. And they come to me and they say, Professor Dershowitz, Harvard has refused to allow a Palestinian flag to be flown in Harvard Yard. We would like you to be our lawyer. And I said, yes, I will. I'll be your lawyer. Because I think you have a right to have the Palestinian flag flown in Harvard Yard. And I said, but here's the deal. I'll defend your right. You fly the Palestinian flag, and you have a ceremony commemorating the death of Arafat, all of that, but I get to speak at it. And they said, okay. I said, that's my fee. I get to speak at it. And I spoke at it. And I said, I want to mourn the untimely death of Arafat, untimely in the sense of he had only died 4 years earlier. We might have had a two-state solution. And, of course, I got booed and everything, but the First Amendment was alive and well in Harvard. The Palestinian flag was flying over Harvard Yard. I was speaking against Arafat in Harvard Yard, and those are the days where that could happen. It couldn't happen today. I was invited I've been now emeritus 11 years at Harvard, 11 years. I have never been invited back once by Harvard to speak about Israel, never once. A student group tried to invite me, Chabad. They had to move my speech off campus for fear of my life. That's the situation today at Harvard.
We'll invite you back here, right?
Happy to come anytime.
For reasons of time, let me suggest that we collect questions and comments, and then you respond collectively. All right. So who would like to get started?
I've answered all the questions. Right here.
I had a comment.
Sure.
I had a comment. Thank you for coming, and you're always welcome to come and speak here. But I have to disagree with you vehemently about your thoughts and attitudes about DE&I and about
what?
Intersectionality and DE&I.
Yeah, okay.
I've spent my entire life fighting for those issues, especially about intersectionality as a Jew, as a woman, as a darker skinned person, and I find it's like co-opting, it's what Trump did, co-opting the American flag. That's all I can really express that when you see an American flag, it looks like a MAGA issue. And
but how does me being opposed to DEI?
It doesn't represent the United States. And the movement of DE&I and intersectionality came out of the feminist movement in many ways from people saying, oh, I'm a gay person and I'm a woman, or I'm a black person and I'm a woman. And
how about I'm a Jewish person and I'm a woman?
And I'm a Jewish person. I'm a Jewish American, black, gay person, and I have certain rights. And while I hear you about Harvard and don't disagree, and I hear you about the far left, I think it is more than unfair and dangerous to categorize those movements as progressive left anti-Semitic. And
okay, it's a comment. It's dead and completely wrong historically. DEI is the foundation of anti-Semitism at every major American university. All of the anti-Semitic rhetoric on October 8th, October 7th, all came from the DEI and intersectionality movement. Just look at that historically. Forget about opinion. Look at the facts. Look at where the statements came from. They came from DEI bureaucracies. They came from intersectionality bureaucracies. You may say it's wrong for DEI to be anti-Semitic, but the fact is DEI is anti-Semitic. The fact is intersectionality is anti-Semitic. Intersectionality excludes Jews. They say you can't be an environmentalist unless you're an anti-Zionist. That's anti-Semitic. And the idea that in order to be a progressive, you have to be anti-Israel is at the core of the problem of American universities. I will continue to fight for the end of DEI as long as I live. It is the most evil thing that has ever affected universities in America today, along with intersectionality and along with everything that goes with it. And so you can have your opinion, I'll have my opinion, but I'm going to fight against it. I am going to fight for the right of me as a Jewish man to support climate control, to support gay rights, to support transgender rights without having to abdicate my Zionism and my Judaism. And I think, by the way, it will end up destroying the progressive movement. It will end up hurting women's rights. It will end up hurting transgender rights. I can no longer stand up for transgender rights if I am told that in order to do so, I have to reject my Zionism and my support for Jews. So, you know, it's the choice of the intersectionality people. And they've made their choice, and I've made my choice, and I hope you will join my choice. And my choice means, by the way, supporting the rights of women, supporting the rights of transgender people, supporting the environment, supporting all of these things, but not doing it at the expense of giving up your identity as a Jew and as a Zionist.
I have the mic. Before I ask my excoriating question, let me just remind you that the women's movement and the Women's March on Washington threw out its Jewish founders. And DEI, as you mentioned, did come out of the women's movement. You were, in the mid-1900s, America's premier constitutional lawyer and First Amendment advocate.
Second only to Nadine, yeah.
And widely reputed to be headed for the Supreme Court. And then perhaps your client list or the manner in which you defended your clients pissed off a lot of people on both the right and left. Any regrets that the methodology rather than the message basically ruined your chances of becoming a Supreme Court justice?
It's a good question. When I was 35 years old, I got an interesting phone call. It was Ted Kennedy. He had been a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he said, Alan, there's a judicial vacancy in the Federal District Court in New York, and I'd like to put your name forward to be a judge. I was 35 years old, and boy, would it have made my mother happy. I slept on it that night. I woke up in the morning. I called Senator Kennedy and said, I was not born to be a judge. I was not born to be a referee. I was born to be a player and to be an advocate. And he said, you know, you never know where an appointment, and by the way, who did he appoint instead? A guy named Steve Breyer, who became a Supreme Court justice. We were clerk, wasn't the same time, but we were both Arthur Goldberg law clerks. And I helped Steve Breyer get his nomination both to the Circuit Court and to the Supreme Court. So no, I have not had one moment of regret for leading the life of an advocate that I have rather than being an umpire or a referee. I would not have enjoyed, Justice Goldberg lasted on the Supreme Court 1.5 years. I would not have enjoyed being a Supreme Court justice. My mother would have enjoyed it, and my children would have enjoyed it, and I think my wife might have enjoyed it, to keep me out of a lot of trouble, but I would not have enjoyed it. You get to live one life, and you got to make choices. And I have friends, Professor Tribe is one of them, who desperately wanted to be on the Supreme Court, lived his life to get on the Supreme Court, and didn't make it. He may have regrets, but I have none.
I want to say something about Alan's controversial client list, having headed an organization that has represented the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis. So I certainly have experience with defending principles that in an immediate case will redound to people and ideas that we deeply despise. But Alan recently reminded me of something that I had forgotten, which is that he will only defend any client one time, not more than one time, precisely to make the point that he is not the hired hand of any client at all. He is advocating for constitutional principles and other neutral principles of law.
I appreciate that, and without getting into the name of who it might be, there have been people recently who have asked me to represent them a second time.
There'll always be another impeachment.
I have said no. I have said no. So, yeah. Tony, yeah.
Yes, to my former professor.
Yeah.
I hope you know that I'm viscerally and ardently opposed to anti-Semitism in all forms.
Yeah.
But how do I avoid the hint of being critical or perhaps anti-Semitic with respect to the views that I have regarding Israeli governmental policy and avoid the suggestion that I might be...
It's a great question. It's a great question. Just treat Israel the way you would treat any other country in the world. Israel is the only country where people say, we don't agree with this policy, therefore it shouldn't exist. You know, you could say, we don't agree with Canada's policy. Nobody ever says it shouldn't exist. But with Israel, people say it shouldn't exist. Be as critical as possible of Israel. I'm very critical of many Israeli policies. I have defended over and over again friends of mine who have been accused of anti-Semitism, for being anti-Netanyahu, for being anti... I think I'm not anti-American, although I'm anti many of the people who run America at the moment. I think people ask me all the time, what is the definition of anti-Semitism? It's so simple. Applying a double standard to things Jewish. That's it. It's the only definition. If you apply the same standard, if you're willing, I have a new book out in addition to the one that you gave out. I've decided to write these little pamphlets because they've really had an impact on college students. So I have a book out called Palestinianism. Now, I'm not anti-Palestinian. I'm in favor of a Palestinian state. What I am against is the world focusing only on the Palestinian issue and only on the anti-Israel issue. When you have people dying in Darfur, people dying all over the world, genocides, real genocides occurring, and nobody gives a damn. It's only about Israel, and it's only about Palestinians. And the Palestinians of all the countries, of all the people that are stateless, the Kurds and the others, no other group has ever been offered a state the way the Palestinians have, over and over again. 1947, 1948, 1967, 2000, 2001, 2005, 2007, and they can get a state tomorrow. If Abbas would call me tonight, I had dinner with Abbas some years ago, and we sat and we had a very nice dinner, and he said, Alan, you're in favor of the two-state solution. Call your friend Netanyahu and tell him to announce that he accepts a Palestinian state. I said, I'm going to do that, but I have to be able to tell him that you, Abbas, accept the right of Israel to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people. He said, I can't say that. I said, I can't make that call. So, if the world would just focus on Israel's flaws and deficiencies in the way they focus on every other country's flaws and deficiencies, or the deficiencies of the Jewish people. You can say bad things about Jews. You can, as long as you say the same, as long as you apply a single standard of criticism. But once you apply the double standard, you've gone over the line. So as long as you apply a single standard, I'm always going to be on your side. I'm going to be on your side anyway because you're my friend and my former student. But if you need ever to be defended against that, I will do it.
With the recent cases that we've had regarding the immigration cases, we've discussed today, rights and afforded to all of us that are citizens. But in terms of those who are not citizens, who are either applying or some of the college students that are coming with visas, what I'm wondering is, have their rights or discussion regarding their rights changed over the years? And if so, can you give some examples?
Oh, yeah, no, look, there's no question. The most lawless area today of constitutional law is immigration. Nobody knows what the law is. Nobody knows what the law is. If I were telling students today who graduated law school now, and they come to me and they say, I don't know what I want to do, I'm graduating law school, become an immigration lawyer. That's where the action is going to be for the next several years. And we know that, Obama deported a lot of people, and we know that Biden deported a lot of people, but nobody's ever done it with the attitude and the vengeance that I think we're seeing from the current administration, and with the disdain for due process. If I had to make a prediction of how the Supreme Court's going to come out on these issues, my prediction is that it's going to sustain the power of the executive, broad power of the executive, over non-citizens. The executive has virtually no power over citizens. Oh, sure, they could deport a 2-year-old child, but you don't even call that deportation. The 2-year-old child is going with its mother. Maybe it was wrong, maybe it was right. We don't know, but a 2-year-old should be with his mother. So I don't know why that case has become the poster child. And if the father has a claim too, and that sounds like a domestic relations issue rather than an immigration issue. But the Supreme Court's going to decide that the executive authority lies with the president to make broad rulings about how to deal with student visas, how to deal with green card holders are different, because green card holders are American persons under the Constitution, and they have virtually all the rights that citizens have. Not all, because they can have their green card revoked if they got it as a result of fraud. So, by the way, so can a citizen. If you are a naturalized citizen and you came into the country and lied in your application, you can actually have your citizenship revoked. It's very, very rarely done, but it can be done. So I think what the Supreme Court's going to do is it's going to divide its opinion. It's going to say the president has the authority, a lot of authority, over visa holders and non-citizens and non-green card holders, but they have to dot every constitutional I and cross every constitutional T. They're going to rule against the administration on due process issues. Now, let's remember the word due process. It's a phenomenal concept when you think about it. People always run the two words together, due process. But what it means is the process that is due you because of your status. And if you're a citizen, you have every conceivable right, trial by jury, right to counsel, all of that. By statute, if you're a green card holder, you have a lot of those rights. That's by statute, not by the Constitution. And if you're a visa holder, you have virtually no rights except for notification, the most fundamental. So the process that's due you depends enormously on what your status is and what the government is claiming about you. And there's enormous confusion about this, and the administration is doing everything in its power to increase the confusion because it wants to engage in wholesale, massive deportations, and the courts are getting in its way. And so I'm going back now, just to end where we began, I'm going back to the month that Jefferson, you all saw the play Hamilton, and the only flaw in the play Hamilton was it has people with signs calling for the election of Jefferson or the election of Burr. Of course, nobody held signs in those days because people didn't determine the outcome of the election. It was determined by Congress. And we know that as soon as Jefferson became president on March 20th, 1801, the first thing he did is he refused to give the commissions to the judges that were appointed by what he called the midnight judges, appointed by the legitimate President Adams. So, you know, what we're seeing is a renewal of the conflict between the judicial branches and the executive branch. Now, the legislative branch could play a very important role in this when they have abdicated. They have done nothing. A lot of this could be solved legislatively because Congress has, in many ways, more power than the president. And what Congress has done is given a lot of the power to the president. So we'll see. In the next election, maybe there'll be a division in the House and the Senate. We don't know. But what we're seeing is not a constitutional crisis. We're seeing a constitutional conflict. And the Constitution has been subtle enough to resolve most constitutional conflicts. Only twice in our history, as far as I know, we haven't been able to resolve it. Once when Andrew Jackson said to still Chief Justice Marshall, who stayed on forever, I think he must have been Chief Justice for 100 years, he said to the Chief Justice, you wrote the decision about the Native Americans, now enforce it. He refused to enforce it. That was a constitutional crisis. It got resolved against rights, against Native Americans, because they were Native Americans, and most Americans didn't care about that. The other constitutional crisis, obviously, was the Civil War, and we couldn't resolve it. We could not resolve the crisis over slavery, and we had to go and fight a war. And more people died in the American Civil War than any other war in history. It was unresolvable, and it got resolved ultimately by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I don't think we're in a constitutional crisis. If the President of the United States were to announce that he will not obey the decisions of the Supreme Court, that would be a constitutional crisis. So far, he said he would, and we'll see. Obviously, he's tried to circumvent, he's tried to appeal, he's tried to challenge, he's tried to do all the things that Jefferson did, but we're not in a constitutional crisis. And I hope if there is, that everybody will come to New Milford, come to the Jewish Community Center or the Congregationalist Church, sit down on a bench, think hard about American history and how important America has been to the world and to all of us, and will resolve the constitutional conflict without there being a crisis. Thank you so much for your hard questions. Thank you.